All right, so let's talk spring garden planning. One of the things that I've noticed, and maybe you guys have noticed this as well, is because we are all maintaining social distance and we're staying and working at home, and we're looking for outdoor activities where we can be engaged and we can do fun stuff. I am finding just a tremendous amount of interest and asks of me to assist folks with gardening. That might be people that are brand new to gardening. That might be people that are growing and they want to expand what they're doing. I'm getting a ton of asks of people that not only do they want to increase their fresh local produce that they're growing for themselves, but they actually want to start doing backyard poultry. And to the point where people are telling me that they're having difficulty finding seeds and having difficulty finding chicks, which I think is pretty interesting. Um, but but that is ultimately hopefully a good thing. It wasn't maybe even 2 generations ago where everybody grew their own food and cooked their own food. And so a resurgence in that, I think, is hopefully one of the silver linings that we're finding as we maintain our social distance. So when I do these classes, I always like to tell folks, make a plan before you get started, because if you have a defined plan, what that's going to do is it's going to maximize the stuff that you enjoy about gardening, and hopefully it will minimize the stuff that you do not enjoy about gardening. And that involves things like, crop rotation. What did I plant last year? Or what is this bug? Or what is this weed? Or things like that. And you have an outstanding tool at your disposal that I like to use all the time, and that's my phone. So what I will do is I will take my phone, and periodically when I'm growing, whether that is my container garden that I have up at my house, or this is a picture right here of my community garden plot that I garden at, I take pictures periodically. What that does is it freezes that image in time, and it shows me what I'm growing, and then it date and time stamps it. And then it even sticks it in a little folder. Plus I get to use it for programming. And for all of us that are doing lots of programming out of extension, having your own pictures when you are creating presentations or doing other things is great, because you don't have to ask anybody's permission to use them. So if you are thinking about putting a garden in, or you are thinking about expanding your garden, the most important thing I think to make your decision about right off the bat is site selection. Site selection is so important because once you establish a garden, it is extraordinarily difficult to move it. When you're going through lots of different magazines or classes or YouTube videos, a lot of times you'll see vegetables need at least 6 to 8 hours of sun. And in the Master Gardener Training Manual, because I teach the vegetable section for Master Gardeners, it lists that vegetables need at least 8 to 10 hours of sun. And vegetables do need at least 6 to 8 hours of sun. Plus, they need the other 6 to 8 hours of sun. So when you're doing production growing and you are growing your veggies or your fruits, these are things that they do best in almost every case with full sun. That is sun that is not being um, hit because of shade from a building or for trees. You want full sun, and your target is the sun in June, and you can get full sun if you have a south facing area. Now, I fully understand that that is not possible for most folks. At my house personally, I have almost no full sun. I have one little tiny patch, and that's where I have my container garden. My front yard is deep shade under maple tree. My backyard is deep shade under maples, walnuts, and hackberries. So I have almost no sun in my yard, which is why I'm a community gardener. So if you have some challenges with sun, what I recommend you do is you make good choices in terms of what you plant. For instance, if you want to grow tomatoes, and tomatoes are one of the most popular things that people grow, and say you have half-day sun, you are growing on the side of your building or side of your garage, maybe you have an east face or a west face, you can still get production from most vegetables. What I would recommend you do is you pick smartly in terms of your choices for varietal selection, meaning that if you're growing tomatoes and you really want to get one of those big heirlooms that get giant and they take 100 days to mature, you're going to have less production. You might not have any production with a half a day sun. But if you were to pick something like a cherry tomato or an early girl or a first lady or some of the saladette style of tomatoes that they mature in 58 or 60 days, you're actually going to get some production in there. So the term that we use when we're doing in Master Gardener training is the right plant in the right place. Site selection is very important. This is a consult that I was asked to do for Chieftain Elementary School when I was in Hocking County, and they had indicated to me that their school had asked them if they wanted to put the garden, they could put it right here. And all the way on the left corner of this farm pond, this is not an ideal spot. So even though they were given that land, when you evaluate it, their plan was to use this farm pond for irrigation, and that's not good agricultural practice to save water. Plus, this is on the north side with a north face where it's going to get shaded by trees. And this is Hocking County, and this is an old farm field. So the deer are just going to eat this to the ground. So what I counseled them is instead of putting it all the way there, which would be difficult for students, why don't we put it right up here? That's right by the front door. This is a south face. There's a water spigot right over here. They can pull their cars up here and unload supplies and soil to make raised beds. And so when you're doing your choice of site selection, take all your variables and inputs into it so that you make a wise choice and your garden will be happier for it. Watering strategies, especially when you're in the planting stages of your garden, are very, very important. And they're tremendously influenced by soil types and the type of garden that you're in. So if you have a raised bed and you fill it with soil, you're going to get decent drainage out of that soil. In my container garden at my house, I have good drainage because I have filled up bags with a mix of compost and potting soil, and that gets good drainage because those are fairly permeable. In my community garden, however, and this is very common for a lot of growers that grow in the ground in Franklin County, we have some heavy clay soil here. And heavy clay soils really, really hold on to water. So say for a raised bed or a container, I'm going to get drying out and water loss and need to irrigate more frequently, especially in the summer, that I would necessarily get in my community garden that has a heavy clay soil which holds water more. Watering strategies in terms of how you water is very, very important because most of the plants that we're talking about, when we're talking about fruits or herbs or veggies, they get affected by any number of different pathogens. It can be bacterial, it can be viral, but the biggie that gets them is fungal disease. And they don't like, in most cases, especially the summer plants like tomatoes or peppers or eggplant, things like that, they don't like to be soaking wet and humid because that predisposes them to fungal disease. So I recommend you don't overhead water. You would irrigate at the base of the plant, soaking in the area around where the roots are in the root zone of the plant so that you minimize evaporative loss and you don't splash water up on the plants. That's also very beneficial because a lot of these fungal spores are in the soil. And I get a lot of questions when people say, when I tell them that, because they'll be like, hey, Tim, Mother Nature waters overhead and Mother Nature does. But one thing I would highly recommend is don't put Mother Nature in charge of your garden because Mother Nature will not do a great job. Don't think of your garden as nature because your garden's not nature, it's agriculture. I like to say that a garden or a lawn or an orchard or a cornfield, however you want to look at any different level of agriculture, it's more like a zoo than it would be like nature. It's a space where you have plants that you protect them from predators. You feed them a certain type of food. They're not normally from around there, and if you didn't take care of them, they would probably die. So think of it as agriculture, and how you care for your plants is very important using agriculture methods because you really want to maximize your production. One of the things that I've noticed this year that is really going to change how I do a lot of what I do is at my community garden, because of the COVID-19, they're not going to be turning the water on, and they've covered up all the water spigots because they don't want the client residents to touch things or congregate in places that can't be sterilized like that. And so I have to figure out some strategies to provide water for my plants. And hauling water is horrible because water is super duper heavy. A gallon of water weighs 8 pounds, and most vegetables require 1 inch of rain per square foot, and that's about 5 pounds. So even if you had a 4x8 raised bed, you have to put 150 pounds of water on it in any given week. And so when you're siting, your garden, raised bed, container, however it is, make sure that you have ready access to a clean, potable source of water. The strategies I'm going to have to go to at my community garden this year, since I don't have guaranteed irrigation, will be picking varieties that might have some more heat tolerance, trying to time some of my plantings around rain, and mulching around the plants so that that conserves water and minimizes evaporative water loss from the soil. When you're preparing your site, okay, so maybe you're taking a piece of the backyard and you're just going to rototill it up there. You've done your site selection, you know your south face or as close to that you can get to it, you're close to your water. Watch out on how you start orienting your beds, when you start digging, and how wet that soil is when you start digging, because with the heavy clay soils we have here in Franklin County, if you were to start doing tillage when it was very wet and then they dry out, you are going to have some compaction issues and some clumping issues that might persist for the entire year of growing. So make sure that you wait until the soil is dried out enough that tillage is going to be doable. And then if you're on a slope, if it's a little bit of a slope, that's okay. But if you're really sloped and it's really steep, then you kind of want to think about doing a terrace effect, because what you don't want is to have a heavy rainfall and all of your soil is at the bottom of the hill. And then depending on where you're at, and we don't have as much problems with this in Columbus, but sometimes if it was a property that used to have an old structure on it and maybe there was some lead paint or something like that, there can be a concern about heavy metal toxicity in the soil. If you have those concerns, contact me offline and I'll assist you on how to get that tested. The method I like to teach about and the method that I use is called the Biointensive Method, and it's been around for thousands of years. And it's a very good method to grow either in an urban environment or a backyard environment because it maximizes a small space into high production. It maximizes your soil health. Raised beds are the ideal method to do the biointensive method in there because it allows you to do minimal tillage with concentration of water and nutrients. And then it relies on a whole bunch of other tools in your toolbox that the grower can use in order to have a healthier harvest. Things like mulching, things like crop rotation, not growing plants in the same family back-to-back years. Doing season extension where you can get some extra planting where maybe you're thinking about harvesting in February or November. I overwintered spinach in a container in my backyard this year that I planted in November, and I've been harvesting it for the past 2 years. And when we like to keep the garden planted, you want to keep a living plant in there at all times. You want to keep roots in the soil. That promotes healthier soil going forward, and soil health is a great #1 input in this method. And then we use the principles of integrated pest management when we deal with all the pests and the weeds and disease that we commonly find affect a vegetable garden. So when we look at soil, and this is soil that's not too wet or not too dry, if it's in perfect balance, you have about 1/4 of air and 1/4 of water, and then 45% are mineral particles, a lot of the things that make up the fertilizers and other things that we have in our soil. But the magic is in this pie slice right here, and that is the organic matter fraction, because organic matter does so many wonderful things in the soil. There are major macro and micronutrients that are needed by all plants to grow. Plus, there's a few structural ones that they get from water, air, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The major macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The important thing to realize is plants require at least a tiny bit, and in some cases, a very tiny amount, parts per million of some of these micronutrients. But if they don't have the needed amount for the specific plant that is growing there, even a little bit of a loss off, even a minor nutrient will cause that plant to be deficient in terms of its growth, and it will limit the effect of growth on that plant. That's why we talk about soil testing all the time. And you guys have heard me talk about soil testing and the importance of soil testing, because having the correct fertility and addressing any deficiencies you have in fertility is going to allow you to have a productive growing season. So this screen shows a top half of a soil test where if you were to look at the soil, it looked amazing. It was a dark, rich, crumbly black soil that looked really, really fertile. It was in a raised bed. But when we tested it, we got back that actually it was deficient in the major macronutrients that would be needed to grow vegetables. So if a grower went into the soil and didn't address those fertilizer deficiencies, they would have a miserable year. They would struggle to get any production, and they would struggle through the entire season for that. When you take a look at the two bottom bars with magnesium and calcium, those are things that I find very, very commonly encountered here in Central Ohio, because Central Ohio is located on top of a large limestone bedrock formation. And so it is constantly leaching calcium and magnesium from that parent bedrock up into our soils. We very, very infrequently see the need to do any kind of calcium supplementation in any growing space here in Franklin County. The way we add fertilizer, there's any number of ways that you can add fertilizer. On the left, there's a bag of a organic slow release granular fertilizer. And then there's some of the ones that are water soluble, where you can mix them and you can spray them around the base of the plant. You've seen the Miracle Grow with the blue crystals that you mix with the tablespoon into your watering can. The important thing is to match your fertilizer needs both with your soil test and to how you are growing. And I'll use a container garden example. So if I was starting from scratch and I was going to plant a bunch of heads of lettuce in my container, I would probably mix a handful of a slow release granular fertilizer in there so it would feed over the life of the lettuce. But if I was going to grow, say, something that was going to be in a container for a long time, like a tomato, and I mix that, when I planted my tomato, I mixed a handful of the granular fertilizer in there so that the roots would get that. Over time, that tomato is going to use up that fertilizer. And as we get these huge rainfalls that we get all the time, constant rainfall, whether you're growing in a container, raised bed, or even in the ground, that is driving that fertilizer down through the soil profile where the roots are into the subsoil. And so sometimes you need to actually continue your fertilization because the plant has either used it all up or the weather has taken it away. And those are cases where I'm mixing a water-soluble fertilizer so that when I irrigate, I fertilize at the same time. Another kind of fertilization protocol is actually called foliar feeding. And what that is you mix that water-soluble fertilizer up and you can mist it directly on the leaves. That is not usable for every nutritional deficiency that plants can get, but there's several of them that works really good at. And so sometimes if I notice that my plants are showing signs of a nutrient deficiency and I need to get some fertility in them quick, especially if I know it's one of the macro or micronutrients that work well with foliar feeding, I will mix up a batch of fertilizer and I will gently mist it right on the leaves of the plant, trying to feed them that way. But it all comes down to soil health. This is the number one adjustable input, right? After you've picked your site and you've got it filled with dirt, you want to make sure that all your decisions going forward have at least one eye on how do I maximize the health of the soil? Because healthy soil equals healthy plants, which ultimately equals healthy people. You constantly are having a slow loss of organic matter in your soil, right? Because each time you till, each time it rains, each time you harvest, a little bit of that is lost. So you want to add a little bit more than you lose every year. You want to build it up over time. You might want to be adding compost in there. You want to add an organic mulch in there. Maybe you want to minimize your tillage and so that you're not injecting oxygen in there, which causes that slow burn that is the organic matter biochemical fire. But working slowly at improving soil health over time by adding organic matter and minimizing its loss is a tremendous benefit for your garden. And it's actually proven by data that they've seen that. So the ideal percentage would be about over 5%. And that sounds like a tiny number, but boy, that would be a huge, great amount to have in a garden. I rarely see soil tests come back with over 5% organic matter levels. Additives that I commonly use, I have a compost pile and I add that in. I used to be able to get manure when I worked in the country, but I don't have that anymore. I use every leaf that falls off my trees. Leaves are a wonderful organic matter source that we get every fall. I use it when I build my compost pile. 50 to 80% of a tree's nutrients end up in the leaves, right? Think of what trees are. They are like nature's ultimate cover crop. They're a plant that sends roots deep down into the subsoil, mines minerals, turns it into a plant, and then sprinkles that organic matter on everybody's lawns once per year. They've studied leaves and they found that there are more nutrients per pound in leaves than in manure, believe it or not. And then another method that we're not going to really go into too much today, but we might do in a future class would be cover crops, which is intentionally growing plants in a space that you will turn right back into the soil so that they can decompose and add their nutrients that way from the process of decomposition. This was a study done by that state up north, and what they found is every 1% increase in soil organic matter was a 12% increase in crop yields. Now that was done in agronomic crops, corn and beans, but that's pretty relatable because a lot of what we grow in a vegetable garden is pretty closely related to agronomic crops. And so in my garden, I'm constantly thinking about how my production practices, my tillage practices, and my planting practices will slowly increase my percentage of organic matter over time. So I said I had a compost pile. I don't know if any of you have a compost pile. I highly recommend it if you're able to do so. And it's a really interesting thing. If you were to go online and you were to Google what is compost, you are going to see a tremendous amount of information on there because it's sort of this wonderful magical thing that does lots of beneficial things where you take a whole bunch of dead things, leaves, kitchen scraps, eggshells, and mixed up in a pile of carbons and nitrogens with some oxygen and water. Over time, that breaks down into organic matter. What I like to say compost is it is the amendment of choice for your soil, right? So if you have heavy clay soil, you don't add sand to it. Sand plus clay equals a brick. If you have sandy soil, you wouldn't add clay straight to it for the same reason. Clay particles and sand particles are wildly different in terms of their sizes. And so if you mix them together, they don't space out really well. Organic matter is a middle-sized particle. And what you do is you add organic matter to a heavy clay soil or you add organic matter to a heavy sandy soil, and that improves both of them. Organic matter has a really interesting, seemingly contradictory statement about it that I like to say, but what it does is it promotes drainage in the soil, but helps with water retention in the soil. I like to add it as much as I possibly can. I have a compost pile. It is not the prettiest compost pile, and I took this picture a couple years ago. This was in the dead of winter, and you can tell what the McDermott family eats in winter. We eat lots of clementines and onions, and we drink lots of tea and coffee, and we eat lots of eggs. I have no idea why somebody threw that perfectly good-looking banana in there. They got an old mum, and this needs mixed up a little bit. I will say that. I mixed it up after I took the picture a little bit because I did not want to have critters in there. Everything was frozen solid. There's two different ways that you make a pile. You can make a hot pile or you can make a cold pile. The difference is the amount of work and the amount of turning that goes in there. A hot pile is just like it sounds. By mixing the carbons and the nitrogens with the proper ratio of water and oxygen in there, you actually promote that decomposition through a slow burning biochemical fire. And it can get hot in there. And the whole reason they call it a hot pile is because those temperatures can get up to 120 to 170 degrees. And that can actually start to sterilize some of the weed seeds and kill the pathogens that are inside that pile. It can be very difficult to do in a backyard environment without a lot of work. Most of the commercial organizations that make compost on a large scale or commercial level, they'll actually take a skid steer and or a bulldozer and they're just turning the pile all the time to keep mixing it. So I'm a cold composter. I just dump my organic matter in there, and Sometimes it's too wet, sometimes it's too dry. Sometimes I have a little bit too much of either a carbon or a nitrogen inside in any one place, and it doesn't completely finish in a year. But I found reliably that at the bottom of that pile, I generally have some usable compost, and every time I dig down through that, I throw another scoop on the top of the pile just to keep seeding that beneficial bacteria throughout it. And for the most part, in the course of a year, I have used up my pile. I try to have that pile pretty close to empty, except for maybe a couple of buckets of partially finished compost by fall. So when my new leaves fall on the ground, I can build a pile from those leaves and I can dump a part of my old compost pile on top of it, sort of like a sourdough bread starter, just to get everything rolling again. Two different common methods for growing are raised bed growing versus row crop growing. So both of them can be very productive. It really depends on your production system. Row crops are generally better for agronomic crop systems. And the reason is row crops were developed using machines to do all of the work needed in that field in terms of planting, in terms of applying pesticides or herbicides, and in terms of harvesting. Usually grown as a monocrop, like a big cornfield or a soybean field, so that that machinery can be used, and that can get some very, very large percentage production yields in a space in a year. Raised beds are a way that a lot of folks grow, and it's one of my favorite ways to grow. And if you have a limited amount of space and you want to maximize your production, this is one of the ways that I highly recommend that you would use. And a raised bed is just like it sounds. There's a few things that you realize that you need to do when you're doing a raised bed so that you are utilizing this in its maximum form. One is, after you construct it, you never walk on it like you would walk on a row garden, right? If you have a row planted garden, you walk in the pathways between the crops that you planted. That's where the roots are. So in a raised bed system, you plant into this raised bed and then you never walk on it. So that soil never gets compacted. That allows the roots of your vegetable plants to really expand and grow and develop dynamic root systems, which develops a dynamic plant. And when you have a raised bed system, you pretty much only put your organic matter and your fertilizer and your water and your weeding and your work and your mulch in the bed that you have planted in. So that concentrates all of your stuff into one space. Whereas, say, for a row garden, if you were going to add organic matter and add it in there, you would add it to the entire garden. If you're watering, you generally irrigate the entire garden. And so some of the places that are getting some of your inputs would be your pathways that don't really necessarily need that input. And sometimes those are the places where the weeds are, and you don't want to water or fertilize your weeds. So there's really only a couple of sizes for raised beds in terms of utilizing this method correctly. 3 or 4 feet wide is ideal. I like to say for the little student humans, 3 foot is a pretty good size because that allows them to reach to the middle without stepping on the bed. 4 feet for the adult-sized humans is perfect because that is the average length that a human can stand on the outside without stepping and reach all the way into the middle. If you make it wider than that, you're going to be tempted to step into that bed because you're going to want to harvest or pull a weed or do something from something that's in the middle of the bed. And if you start walking through your raised bed, you are defeating the purpose of that. You space your raised beds out in terms of the pathway size depending on your access needs and your production system, right? So a raised bed that would be constructed for an urban farm would have minimal pathways between their raised beds because they would maximize the amount of space that they want to grow in. When we do, say, an educational garden or a school garden, we might have a lot more space between the raised beds because we need to have a place to put people when we teach classes. If you have some accessibility or some disability needs, that changes the spacing of the raised beds and the height of the raised beds as well. But one thing that I stress to growers is when you are building a raised bed, do the math on how a raised bed works. Because if you build a 4x8 raised bed out of 12-inch boards, that is 32 cubic feet of soil. And a cubic yard is 27 cubic feet. You need a tremendous amount of soil to fill a raised bed. And because of erosion and because you'll be harvesting produce out of it, you need to replace the soil in a raised bed, usually about 20% or so of the soil every year in order to keep that bed completely filled up. So here's a picture of my garden, and I use raised bed technique because at its heart, a raised bed is technique. Forms are useful when you want to get a lot of height, but for the most part, a raised bed is a concept, not a thing. What I do with my garden is I put mulch. This is when I used to be able to get lots of hay when I worked in the country. Now I use plastic, but I put mulch where the tractor goes through when the tractor plows up the garden because that's already compacted. And then I use a garden rake to shape the growing space into raised beds. And that is where I grow into. Once I shape those beds and get them planted, I never walk on them. I only weed and water and fertilize and put all my inputs into my raised bed space. Containers are a dynamic way to grow, and they are becoming very, very popular because they have some really cool new technology in container. If you look in the back row right there, you'll see giant plastic container buckets that I got at a yard sale years and years ago, and I need to top off more soil in those, but they're very tall. But in the front row, those are grow bags, and grow bags are a product that came out of the nursery and landscape industry, and they're inexpensive. Um, you can get them shipped to you for very little money, and you can get them in giant sizes. So it allows you to plant now with a decreased cost input than it used to be. It used to be the containers were the limit of the cost. Now you can get cheap containers, and the soil is the limit in terms of cost that way. But in my container garden right now, I have Asian cabbage growing and spinach and lettuce and kale, and I planted radishes and green onions in that front left bin, and everything's doing great right now. So I like to say mulch is one of the, if not most important tools in the toolkit of the biointensive gardener, because what it does is it eliminates or decreases all the things you hate to do, right? I hate to weed. I hate to water. Now I have to haul water if I want to water. Mulch does wonderful things. Placed around plantings, it will decrease disease by keeping those fungal spores in the ground where they belong. It will decrease evaporative loss of water, so you have to water less, and it will smother weeds. I like to say that besides being weed control, pest control, and disease control, mulch is work control. Lots of different kind of mulches that are out there. Organic mulches like straw or shredded leaves or hay, or inorganic mulches like the landscape fabrics and black plastics that are out there. Whichever way you use, depending on your budget and production system, you're going to find that it pays off in terms of time, energy, and work savings. So here's an instance where I use mulch. This is leeks, and if you've ever grown leeks, one of the things about them is you plant them very early in the spring and you don't harvest them until very late in the fall. That's a lot of time to weed and water a plant. And so what I do is I mulch them very, very deeply after I plant, and so I have to do minimal weeding on these, and I have to do minimal watering on these. I can just make sure that they stay healthy and address fertility, and at the end of the season, I get me a nice big leek harvest. Crop rotation is a very important thing in terms of the control of pests, weeds, and diseases, because in terms of how different pests, disease, and weeds affect plants in the same family, they affect them very similarly. So if you can rotate growing plants in the same family into a different space every 3 years, you will have a tremendous decrease in the amount of damage from pests, weeds, and disease. Meaning that 1 year, if you have, say, 3 raised beds in your garden, you put tomatoes in one year, you put it in bed 2 the second year, you put it in bed 3 the third year, you don't come back to bed 1 until the 4th year. 3 years between rotations is ideal. But Tim, you say, what if I can't? What if I have, say, 1 raised bed and I want to grow tomatoes because tomatoes are my favorite? Then you use all of the other tools in your toolkit. That's when you're mulching to keep the fungal spores in there. That's when you're making sure your fertility is perfect so that tomato doesn't have any stress because it's missing a micronutrient. That's when you pick a variety that might have disease resistance. So if you can't do rotation the way you would like to do that, use all the other tools in your toolkit to ensure that you have a healthy harvest of your vegetables. And here's a listing of the vegetable families, and I can get that to you if you need it, but you'll see that when I talk about rotating, I talk about vegetable families, right? So if we look at Solanaceae, the nightshade family at the top, that includes things like tomatoes or peppers or eggplant, potatoes. They're all cousins, they're all related, and the same diseases affect through that family. So if you plant tomatoes in one bed and then next year you plant peppers or eggplant or potatoes, you haven't done a true crop rotation, and you might be at risk for some of the diseases, weeds, or insects that affect that family to have a jump start on affecting them this year as well. So what can you plant right now? We have April 10th right now, and there's a ton of stuff that you can plant. We're supposed to have decent weather on Saturday, then we're going to have rain. So if you're like me, I'm planning on finishing my spring garden planting on Saturday so that I don't have to haul water, and I will let my frenemy, Mother Nature, do some watering for me. So great choices to plant right now for spring include things like peas or radishes. You can put spinach and lettuce in the ground. Cabbage family can be started from seed right now. I would probably do things like radishes or Asian cabbage. You could do transplants though if you were shopping at one of the nurseries or garden stores for things like broccoli or cauliflower or Brussels sprouts or cabbage. Carrots are great started from seed. Onions you can plant right now. Sets or transplants would be best for that. Potatoes planted as seed potatoes. The time is now for those. Green onion seed would be one type of onion seed that you could put in the ground right now. And then beets and Swiss chard, which believe it or not are cousins in the same family, they can be started right now as well. So let's see if we have any questions in the chat box. We don't. All right, fire some questions away, colleagues, and let me know what you want to learn about that. If not, and you guys are full of knowledge, I promised that I would finish this by 1 o'clock so that you guys can all go to the Excel Learning and Organizational Development class, which sounds very, very fun. And I will unmute you guys all so that if you want to say something, you go right ahead. So you guys are all live right now.
Hey, Tim.
Yep.
My son's built me a beautiful raised garden, 4x4, and it's about 2.5, 3 feet tall. And they put soil in it, and it was doing very well. And then little white moths came.
Yes, they did. So you were probably growing some broccoli or collards or kale or something like that. So the little white moth is the cabbage white butterfly. And the cabbage white butterfly is the most common butterfly in Ohio, but it is an invasive species, and it lays these little green worms that will chew down your plants down into bits. And that is one of the probably the most devastating of the pests that will affect some of the families that way. The nice thing about a whole bunch of those larval worms that affect plants and eat foliage is there's an organic control for them that is got labeled use as short as 1 day after application, that you can spray plants that you will use a completely organic product that will take care of that problem for you. The active ingredient in that is called spinosad. Spinosad. It comes as lots and lots of different formulations. So that's the active ingredient. You'd have to hunt for any number of the various products that are on the market that people have out there. But I will put that in the chat. So spinosad.
Do I cover the plants at all to try to keep pests from them?
The only worry that you would have if you cover plants would be if they have a need to be pollinated. okay?
Mm.
And we talk about pollinators and the need for pollinators all of the time. And pollinators are a wonderful thing, but not every crop in the garden, believe it or not, especially a lot of the spring stuff, needs a pollinator, right? If you grow lettuce, you harvest it long before you ever see a flower. Broccoli, if you grow it, the part that you eat is the flower buds before they open up. So things like green beans, tomatoes, zucchini, pumpkins, they're all pollinator dependent. And we have to be very, very careful that we make sure that we don't cover them so we allow pollinators access to it. But yes, you could use an insect barrier, very thin, to cover any crop to keep insects off that are not pollinator dependent. But just check, because boy, those insects seem to kind of sneak their way underneath it. And then basically they're
Um,
munching away underneath there and you have no idea that they're under there chowing down on your food.
okay, thank you.
So how do you keep pests away from plants? It's Besides using that barrier, it's really tough to keep pests away from plants because they spend all day thinking about how they're going to eat your plants when we have to work and do other things that way. So the key thing that you would do is you want to identify what the pest is so that you can pick the best control method that works within your system. So anybody who has a problem with a pest or a weed or disease, you know that you take a picture of it, you send it to me, and I will work with you on making sure that we develop a protocol for that. So Christina asks, what percentage of topsoil and organic matter? When I'm filling a container, because I have a compost pile, I try to put as much of it in compost as I can, quite honestly, because topsoil I have to purchase and compost I have in my backyard. I don't have an unlimited source of compost, however, so it's usually about 50-50. But I built raised beds, quite honestly, when I was an urban farmer back when I was in Hocking County, and we filled them with pure compost because in Hocking County, we could not find topsoil whatsoever. We were in an Appalachian county. There wasn't really lots of topsoil, but we had lots of compost because we had lots of leaves because we have lots of trees down there. And so I've grown in pure compost and got great results, right? Anybody who has a compost pile, where are the very beautifulest plants that grow in your entire yard? They're the volunteer plants that come sprouting out of my compost pile. I usually have like tomatoes growing in there and Halloween pumpkin from when I threw the jack-o'-lantern in there, and they start to take over the back of the yard. Can I start my herb raised garden from seeds Saturday? I only have seeds, not starter plants. Maybe. And I say maybe in that, sure you can, right? You can plant seeds and things sprout from seed. Certain herbs would be best planted now and certain herbs would not be, right? Because basil, for example, is a heat-loving summer annual herb. I would not plant basil seed right now. I would plant dill seed, I'd plant chives. I planted my parsley seed this past week. So those are some examples of ones that I would plant now. And then certain plants actually do better if you put them in as a transplant because the baby seeds take so long to germinate that it will drive you crazy and take you years before you get anything. So like if you were to grow thyme or rosemary from scratch, boy, that takes forever. Where what I would do is, since those are perennial, and especially something like sage, you buy it once and you'll have sage for the rest of your life, and it'll probably take over your corner, your garden that way. So certain ones are better from transplant, certain ones are better from seed, and just make sure you are planting them for the appropriate one. Nora asks, what cover crops do you recommend? I recommend all of them, but I recommend them depending on your problem, meaning you don't have one cover crop to choose from. And cover crops are probably their whole own hour class because that is how long it takes me to get through the base information on them. But just to touch on what they are, they're a crop that you plant, usually kind of related to some agronomic crop, that you use that as a tool to address a concern. So when somebody says, what cover crops do you recommend? I say, what problems do you need to address in your garden? Right? Do you need organic matter? There are cover crops that grow and they produce tons of biomass. Do you need to prevent weeds or smother weeds? There are cover crops that are elite at smothering weeds. So your choice of cover crop is actually guided by your problem. And you have your problem, you figure out what season it is, because some cover crops do good in cold weather, overwintered even. Some cover crops do well in warm weather and wouldn't tolerate overwinter. Then you pick from a list of cover crops that will address your problem. But you guys are full of awesome questions today. Outstanding. Do we have any more questions? All right, I want to show one more thing for you guys so that you know that you are supported in your growing, and let me know if you want to do another class going forward. But I have been putting a lot of stuff on Growing Franklin, and I don't know how many of you guys have seen the website that is the local food production site here for OSU Extension in Franklin County. But Growing Franklin is the site where I will put lots of marketing material on classes, and I will embed videos if I create them. And this is where, if there's informative articles that we want to put out, anything that's going to assist a backyard grower, community gardener, teacher, educator, urban farmer, that is going to get put on here. So you guys, there was a couple of questions about starting some seeds. I did a class just last night for Franklinton Farms on Zoom on seed starting, and I recorded that Zoom, so you can go right on to Growing Franklin. You can click on that image and you can watch that Zoom. I'm trying to keep my Zooms shorter than traditional. I know everybody is stuck staring at screens all day long, so like this one, I want to get the information to clients in about 30 minutes so that that gives time for questions. So this Zoom is only about 37 minutes long. And then I did create some videos on seed starting and transplanting so that you have some direct sort of skill set development things that you can use. So take a look at this. I'll be adding content to it throughout the season, teaching virtual gardening classes. If you are wanting to get into backyard poultry, I did a backyard poultry presentation in partnership with Morrow County last week. And I will also be doing a bunch of different seasonal updates on the weather and what to grow right now and how plants are going and what kind of pests and weeds and diseases I'm seeing in terms of my scouting. And so that will be something that you can use to assist you in your growing besides doing some of these classes. All right, gang. Any other questions? Oh, maybe. All right, we want more sessions. Outstanding. So what we'll do is, if this time works for folks, maybe in a few weeks on a Friday noon, we will do another class and continue all of our learning so that you guys can grow super awesome gardens at your house. And on that note, we will stop recording.